Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today we're going to be looking at the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science, or more specifically, at a recruiting video of theirs. It is one of the funniest things I've seen in a long time, and while there are serious points I'm going to be making about it, it's too much fun not to laugh at it while I do. So if you've ever wanted to join Scientology, but are scared to get rid of your body thetans, and if you have anywhere between $25 and $5,000 a year to spend on an internet cult, I've got the science-themed religion replacement for you. Check it out.
This is Charles Darwin. Way back in 1859, he figured out that life evolved through a process of natural selection.
That may be the worst illustration of life evolving through a process of natural selection I've ever seen. That was several fish eating each other. If that was meant to show successive forms of fish as they become better at surviving, this is illustrating one of the worst misconceptions about evolution. That it always makes things bigger and stronger. And if it isn't that, it's an amazing non sequitur, since a bunch of fish eating each other isn't evolution. Also, nothing survived. Well, there was that one fish at the end. We're only 12 seconds into this video, and the first 5 seconds was somebody doing warm-up exercises on a piano. Moving on.
Then in 1976, this guy, Richard Dawkins, took it farther with his book called The Selfish Gene.
What? Are you kidding me? Seriously? Straight from Charles Darwin to Richard Dawkins? That was the next big thing that happened in biology? The selfish gene? No mention of Watson and Crick or DNA? That whole thing about people discovering genetics is just a minor footnote? And this is ignoring how trivial the selfish gene actually is. Here, listen to them make the case for how groundbreaking its results were.
Richard said, genes are selfish. Not in a hogging all the cookies kind of way. Genes that selfishly keep their hosts, plants, animals, us, alive to reproduce, are favored by evolution.
That was a terrible description of what the selfish gene is about. Stated like that, it would be one of the most trivial books ever written. Not that it's a lot more significant than that, but come on, give the devil his due. Seriously, why do I have to be the one to explain this? The metaphor Dawkins gave was that if a gene is trying to maximize the number of copies of itself, it doesn't really care whether that's in one host or many, and so sacrificing one host for the benefit of many hosts benefits the gene. The basic problem with natural selection he was trying to solve is altruism. If an animal is willing to die for the sake of another, and many are, this can't possibly be because it maximized their chance for survival. The selfish gene was basically a general riff on the idea that altruism benefits an organism's relatives and descendants, which is about as good, at least from the perspective of what tends to produce more living descendants. But the metaphor of genes being selfish made it more vivid. Of course, if you take this out of the land of metaphor, since two sequences of base pairs and two distinct pieces of DNA are not in any sense the same, and thus cannot be selfish in benefiting each other, all it's saying is that whatever there tends to be more of, there's usually more of. That is a trivial observation which is true, but has no explanatory power. Of anything that exists, you can say, it must have been successful at existing. Of course, but so what? That amounts to saying, things are the way they are because what made them this way, made them this way. No kidding. This is football commentary levels of insight. This game is going to be about point production. In order to win, they're going to need to score more points than the other team. All of the apparent explanatory power was hidden pretending that genes are conscious agents with intentions. Actually, it's even more underhanded than that, because the basic approach is to show how if the system is already set up, it will work. Ants sacrificing themselves ensures the survival of the queen, who produces more ants that will sacrifice themselves. Which, incidentally, you don't need any concept of genetics to say. Okay, yes, given this system which already exists, we can see how it does work in practice, and therefore it doesn't fail in practice. But that doesn't tell us how a different, stable system successfully transitioned to this stable system. And you can see the same thing in popular evolutionary psychology. Some study shows a difference between men and women, and then someone comes up with an explanation about how this enabled men to hunt mammoths, while it made it easier for women to care for children. Then a flaw is found or some other study contradicts it, and the same people slightly modify their arguments to show how in fact the opposite helped men hunt mammoths, while women cared for the children. This is basically a biological version of a psychic cold reading someone. I see a shape. It's a silhouette of a man, possibly a child, or maybe it's a woman. Its name starts with a letter. I can't quite make it out. I think it's a consonant? Uncle Harry? Yes, that's it. Uncle Harry is telling me that he knows something about you. What is it? He's telling me that your genes do something beneficial for someone. Do you mean for my descendants? Yes, that's it. He's saying that your genes do something beneficial for your descendants. Yes, they do. There was no way you could have known that. This is amazing. I haven't read much of Dawkins' voluminous writing, but from what I've read about him, this is a basic problem with all of his work. His skill is in creating suggestive imagery that makes things feel plausible, not in saying anything insightful. But, speaking of he who knows everything's voluminous writing, we're about to hear about his masterpiece.
Then, after many more books on evolution, Richard wrote The God Delusion. That really shook things up.
A heavenly choir. Really? This is how they present the God Delusion. Angels singing as it appears from the sky in a bright light. Do these people have any self-awareness at all? You know, if they had the word cult in flashing red letters throughout this video, it would be redundant. Throw off the shackles of religion. Attach the shackles of our religion substitute. At least we won't tell you to feel bad about anything. At first. The unreasonable demands will come later, after you've given us a lot of money. I wonder if they have their own version of the Shahada. Something like, there is no God but evolution, and Richard Dawkins is its prophet. Anyway, given how incompetent their description of the selfish gene was, let's see how they describe the God Delusion.
Turns out people wanted to use critical thinking to evaluate their religious views. Richard showed them how.
What? This is delusional, ironically enough. I mean, this has no connection with reality. Turns out, people have been critically thinking about religion for thousands of years. The Greeks argued endlessly about the nature of divinity. Christianity has a very long history of brilliant theologians thinking very carefully and logically about all of the implications of every aspect of Christianity. In fact, the scholastics in the medieval period had a reputation for being too logical. The idea that carefully and logically thinking about religious views is somehow novel could only be believed by a catastrophically uneducated man. Which, incidentally, Richard Dawkins appears to be. I read as much as I could stomach of the God Delusion, and every page reeks of a man whose intelligence is very trivially above average, trying to make sense of the world on the assumption that he's a genius. Which brings us back to that sequence of geniuses earlier in the video. I can't believe we're still less than 40 seconds in. Anyway, you might recall it started with Charles Darwin, ended with Richard Dawkins, and had no one else in it. This is the company which Richard Dawkins believes he's in. At least this explains why he's running a cult. And the problem is that when he comes across things he doesn't understand, like, for example, everything about Christianity, he assumes that since he's so much smarter than everyone else, the reason he doesn't understand it must be that it's too stupid to make even a little bit of sense. But the problem is that he's too stupid. And in the God Delusion, he's very explicit about what he doesn't understand. He leaves no room for doubt. He is unambiguously unable to understand concepts of only moderate complexity. And bear in mind, I'm not talking about believing in them. He simply can't even understand what the concepts are. This wouldn't be so big a deal if he didn't couple it with an astonishing level of hubris in being utterly unwilling to even hypothetically consider that him not understanding something might be a fault in him and not in the thing. Moving on to the second sentence, Richard showed them how to do it. No. If there is one thing that isn't in the God Delusion, it's critical thinking. Now, as I said before, I didn't read the entire book. I skipped around. So, maybe he cleverly hid logical reasoning in one of the sections I didn't read. If so, no one I've seen talking about the God Delusion noticed it either. What the God Delusion has is a great deal of sneering and preening. and bitching and moaning. Technically, his argument for why there almost certainly isn't a God is at least an argument, so I guess you could call it critical thinking in some sense, but I'd be a lot more willing to call it that if some critical thinking had been applied to it. It may not be, as one professor of logic called it, possibly the single most incompetent logical argument ever made for or against anything in the whole history of the human race, but it is at least in that neighborhood. One of the smallest problems with it is a catastrophic misunderstanding of probability. I won't go into detail here because I talked about this in my video, The Problem with Probability, but suffice it to say that if all the other cataclysmic flaws with the argument were somehow fixed, it would still be worthless. No, what Richard Dawkins taught people to do in The God Delusion is to sneer condescendingly at smarter people while patting yourself on the back for how much better you are than everyone else. It is such a terrible book that whoever gave Richard Dawkins his PhD should take it back, and take back the PhDs of everyone else they gave PhDs to, and give their own PhD back. And maybe for good measure find the building world as happened and demolish it. Well, at least their description of the book was only 2 sentences. Skipping ahead a little bit, the video says that the book was successful, which is actually true, it did sell over 3 million copies, and so Dawkins set up the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. It then addresses the question of why did a Brit set up his his foundation, in the US. I mean, without stating the obvious that America has way more money than Britain, and that the messenger of evolution's British accent doesn't sound nearly so authoritative to British people. So, what's their first reason?
Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson, focus on the family.
So what? How pathetic is your life if Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson seem like existential threats to anything? Why not Krampus and the Boogeyman? I mean, Jerry Falwell? The guy was 72 when the foundation started and died the year afterwards. Way to pick your enemies, guys. And wait a minute. Be One of Us was published on June 5th, 2015. Falwell had been dead for 8 years at that point. In all that time, they couldn't come up with a scarier enemy than the ghost of Jerry Falwell? I can't wait to see what else the Supreme Commander of Science was afraid of. Maybe a William Jennings Bryan zombie?
George W. Bush limits stem cell research.
Actually, he limited government funding for embryonic stem cell research. He didn't make anything illegal, and he increased government funding for adult stem cell research, otherwise known as the stem cell research which actually might produce usable results, since they wouldn't have massive tissue compatibility issues. Also, abortion isn't actually a religious issue. It's just that, with some exceptions, religious people seem to be more moral than irreligious people on this issue. Well, there may be some cause and effect because religious people believe that their beliefs are supposed to conform to reality, while most atheists seem to hold that their beliefs define reality. Life has the meaning we give it, is I think the preferred phrasing. Be that as it may, you can find atheists who are against abortion because they don't believe that ensoulment happens only after a baby leaves its mother's womb. Obviously, the beloved of science isn't one of them, but it would have been a lot of fun to see a debate between him and Christopher Hitchens on the subject.
George W. Bush goes to war after consulting a higher father.
Because if there's one thing we want in a leader, it's not having any sort of check on whether going to war really is the right thing to do. We want someone who, after concluding that going to war is the right action, just leaps ahead without any thought that maybe he's made a mistake. Or were they trying to suggest that George W. Bush made the decision to go to war based solely on prayer? I'd like to think that these people can't be that stupid, but, it might just be that they think the people they're trying to get money from are that stupid. Perhaps they're just banking on H.L. Mencken's famous statement, often paraphrased as, "Nobody ever went broke underestimating the intelligence of the American public." I could imagine Dawkins taking that statement literally and setting up in America because of it.
Evolution under attack in textbooks in Texas.
Burn the heretics! I know that some true believers don't really get this, but not even fundamentalists object to the idea that allele frequency changes in a population over time. And while most Christians, including myself, have no objection to the idea that evolution was the origin of species, it doesn't actually matter very much. As a Christian, I'm interested in truth, so it's interesting that it's probably true, but there's no practical value to knowing the origin of species. I prefer that creation science not be taught in schools as a possible explanation of speciation, but Adults are supposed to prioritize things that matter over things that don't. And the way that people come out of schools barely knowing history and misunderstanding what probability means is a much bigger problem than possibly being wrong about where species came from. Remember, this is a pitch to give them money. Money which could be spent on archery equipment, or steak, or wine, or video games, or even given to a shelter for the homeless. The things they do with the money they're asking for are supposed to provide more benefit to you, or the world, than grinding the money into powder which you can use to polish your socks. And their glorious leader is wetting his secular underpants because middle schoolers might hear 2 theories of the origin of species, rather than just one.
Climate change deniers.
I have not seen proven, proof that it is entirely man-made.
I think that this is the best of the entire group of complaints, because it is explicitly somebody who lacks a belief in a claim because they haven't seen sufficient evidence for it. And in fact, the only evidence anyone in the public is ever presented about climate change being man-made is that it is the consensus of scientists, so kneel down and believe. Which, come to think of it, is a fair representation of Dawkins' view about evolution. In fact, skipping ahead by a few seconds to the section where they say what they're going to do with your money, here is them basically saying that.
The Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. Middle school kids need to know why evolution is true. Not one of many possible truths, but true. Like, really true.
Because evolution isn't a scientific theory to Richard Dawkins. It's a dogma. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with dogmas. They are necessary in any system made for human beings. I only use the term in a derogatory way here because he's being a massive hypocrite in promoting the dogma of his cult while denying that it's a dogma. Scientologists do roughly the same thing. According to their website, Scientology is not a dogmatic religion in which one is asked to accept anything on faith alone. On the contrary, one discovers for oneself that the principles of Scientology are true by applying its principles and observing or experiencing the results. See? It's scientific. I once heard a rule that anything with science in its name doesn't have anything to do with science, and I suspect that this is true both of Scientology and the Richard Dawkins Foundation for Reason and Science. Continuing with what they'll do with your money.
Number 2, the openly secular campaign.
This is just a list of their knockoff Tom Cruises and John Travoltas, so I'm gonna skip it.
Number 3, change the culture. How do you do that?
Yes. How? The message that your life is a meaningless cosmic joke with no punchline, with the punchline you give it, is not exactly an easy sell, so my guess is the answer is going to be, not very honestly.
By sponsoring, commissioning, and producing plays and movies, helping high schools across the country put on Inherit the Wind.
Inherit the Wind? Oh, of course it's Inherit the Wind. How could it be anything else? Let me borrow Wikipedia's description of Inherit the Wind. A play by Jerome Lawrence and Robert Edwin Lee, which debuted in 1955, the story fictionalizes the 1925 Scopes monkey trial as a means to discuss the then-contemporary McCarthy trials. It's only fitting that Dawkins wants to promote a fictionalized version of history. Until he started being a professional atheist, his whole career was writing just so stories to make grade school understandings of science sound interesting. But he's a professional atheist now, so of course we come to the part where he asks for money. At least there's no mention of everyone living together on a compound, which is actually just a bunch of hastily built sheds that they call the Temple of Reason and Science. I'm going to omit the part of the video where they brag about page views and how many Twitter followers the first among scientists has.
Want scientific literacy? We do too. Want secular acceptance? We do too. Want critical thinkers? We do too.
I guess that they can't be too obvious about saying, "Are you one of the good people?" And here's the thing. As a Christian, I wish that there was a lot more scientific literacy and critical thinking. There would be far fewer atheists if there were. But of course, I mean that without inverted commas around scientific literacy and critical thinking. I'm not one of the elect, clearly. I guess people like me need to be bred out of the gene pool. Hey, I wonder if we're going to find out that there's a rule that female members of the Foundation are required to share their selfish genes with the chosen one. That wouldn't be in the recruiting video anyway.
If you are one of us, be one of us.
Be one of us. Well, at least it's marginally better than brains. Though, to some degree, it means the same thing. You know, this has to compete with Daniel Dennett's term bright for the most tone-deaf thing ever said. At least if they showed their glorious leader holding a gun to a dog's head and saying, "Join now or I shoot this puppy," they could have passed it off as a joke. Somehow the propaganda ministers of this cult thought that if you are one of us, be one of us was actually a good idea. And not just for one day either. Their video was made over a year ago, and as of the date I'm recording this video, you can still find that slogan on their website. But the advertisement isn't over yet, because we get some wise words from Reason's most precious gift himself.
The truth is more magical, in the best and most exciting sense of the word, than any myth or made-up mystery or miracle. Science has its own magic, the magic of reality.
Become a disciple of the one above all other scientists because his magic is real! This video is unbelievable. I mean, literally, I've watched this video at least half a dozen times now, and I still can't believe it's real, despite the fact that I found it on the Foundation's website. Anyway, that isn't what magic means, unless he's going for a Disney World Magic Kingdom sort of magic. Which fits, actually, because like Disney World, he's looking to extract a lot of money from you. Though, on a more serious note, what he means by magic is actually awe, which is analogous to wonder, but much more. The real concept of magic is about control. That's why natural science largely got its start in the occult. In many ways, chemists are just alchemists who were successful. This is also why magic has nothing to do with miracles, because miracles are, by definition, outside of our control. Miracles can produce awe, but magic, like, say, your cell phone, produces at first the feeling of power and perhaps amazement, and then you just take it for granted, at least until it breaks. Science cannot possibly be a substitute for religion, because science is about dominating nature, and religion is about fitting into our proper place in creation. And that's why miracles inspire awe. They reveal to us that we're in the presence of something above us. And it is quite telling that Dawkins doesn't know this. In one sense, it's just one more thing in a long list of things he doesn't know. But in another sense, it sums up his problem. He literally doesn't know what humility means. So he's had to come up with a substitute, and he'll sell it to you. For $25 per year, you'll get his newsletter. For $240 per year, you'll get to have a members-only online chat with the High Priest of Evolution. If you can afford $1,000 per year to buy fake friends, you can join the Reason Circle, which gets you member discounts on merchandise and an invitation to a members-only event where you get the privilege of actually seeing the Lord of Science with your own eyes. For $5,000 a year, you get 2 guest tickets to that event. Maybe that's to bring along people who are one of us but just can't afford to be in the Reason Circle? I can't imagine why you'd want to let an outsider breathe the same air as the most perfect man who ever lived, reproductive success be upon him. I think it's telling that the lowest circle of this hell is the Darwin Circle, but there is no Dawkins Circle. Only one man can be worthy of that circle, and he's already in it. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.